Welcome to Sunday Sermons, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of John, chapter 9, verses 1 through 25. And I'll read the first 5 verses for us now, as we prepare to hear from lead Pastor Travis Simone, as he helps us continue in our sermon series titled, Knowing the Road In. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world."
But do you know Jesus? This is a question that was asked repeatedly in an interesting class I took in college called Sex, Cults, and Small Denominations in America. And every time the professor shared the title of the class, he would say sex, S-E-C-T-S, S-E-C-T-S, cults and small denominations in America. He didn't want the college kids to get any big ideas as they were taking this class or signing up for the class. And as we talked about some particular forms of Christianity, he used to say, there are these certain kinds of Christians, and they are obsessed with the question, do you know Jesus? They don't care, do you go to church? They're not interested in confirmation class or your baptismal status. They just want to know, do you know Jesus, he would say. Well, John is that kind of Christian. John is that kind of follower of Jesus. Last week, Rich taught us from John 6 that Jesus is the road in. He is the culmination of God's Exodus-shaped rescue. He's the road into God's presence, power, and promises. But John doesn't just want us to know that Jesus is the road in. John wants us to know the road in. And so John records 7 different occasions when Jesus used the phrase, I am. Exodus, if you were listening last week, this is the very name God used to reveal himself to Moses in the burning bush. With each use of the phrase, John helps us know better the God whose presence in the tabernacle was too thick for Moses to get in. That presence has now come in and as Jesus Christ to fully and finally lead us into God's presence, power, and promises. Do you know Jesus? I think Professor Holmes would be proud of me asking the question this morning. Do you know Jesus? Well, in John 9, Jesus says, I am. Exodus. I am the light of the world. And John 9 is an invitation to see Jesus clearly. Notice how the man sees Jesus more clearly as the story unfolds. I'll start in verse 10. The entire story has been printed in the bulletin. So they said to him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. The first way the man sees Jesus is actually quite simple. He just calls him the man called Jesus. It's not a lot. I don't know much, but I know there's this guy and I know that other people call him Jesus. The story progresses. Verse 17, he learns a little bit more. or he sees Jesus a bit more clearly. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He's a prophet." So he moves from the man called Jesus to now he's come to see that, well, at least he must be a prophet of some kind. Toward the end of the story, Jesus finds the man in verse 35, and Jesus asks him a question. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Now, this is likely one of the most misunderstood titles for Jesus. Some people just hear Son of Man and they think it relates to the human side of Jesus. It's actually an allusion back to Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel has this vision of the very throne room of God. He sees God seated on his throne, and then something surprising happens in the vision, something Daniel did not expect. He knew that God was seated on a throne in the heavenly realm, but then he sees, and he says, someone like a Son of Man who is brought to God. And God gives to him an everlasting dominion. He gives him a kingdom that will have no end. And the kingdom that Daniel sees that is given to this Son of Man is made up of people of every tribe, every nation, every language group. So Jesus says, "Do you believe that I'm that guy that Daniel saw in the vision? The one to whom God has given dominion and authority, this everlasting kingdom." So it goes from the man called Jesus to the prophet to the Son of Man. And here's the man's answer in verse 38. He said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. And the final title that the man gives to Jesus is Lord. He moves from the man called Jesus to just shy of the most dramatic confession of Jesus' identity in the Gospel of John. At the end of the gospel, you get the most dramatic one. Thomas confessed Jesus as my Lord and my God. But Son of Man and Lord is not too far behind Thomas. See, if John 9 is this invitation to see Jesus clearly as we see the man move progressively through these steps of clearer and clearer vision of Jesus, the man born blind surely opened this invitation. He opened the invitation to see Jesus clearly. My question is, how did he do it? How did he open this invitation? Maybe there are three questions we could ask about John 9 this morning. How did the blind man see Jesus clearly? How do we see Jesus clearly? And how do we know when we've seen Jesus clearly? First, how did the blind man see Jesus clearly? Look at verse 6 with me. Having said these things, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud. The man starts seeing Jesus clearly based on Jesus' initiation. Jesus initiated with the man. Having said these things refers only to what Jesus has said up till now. The blind man has said nothing and done nothing up till this point in the story. The story begins as Jesus passed by, Jesus saw and took the initiative with the blind man. The man is not healed by taking initiative to reach out to Jesus. It is Jesus who takes the initiative to reach out to him. Look at verse 12 of our passage. The people are asking the blind man that has now received sight, where is he? Where is Jesus? And what does the guy say? He says, I don't even know. I don't even know where he is. Again, back to verse 35, the end of the passage. When Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said to him, Jesus found the blind man. The blind man did not find Jesus. In C.S. Lewis's series, The Chronicles of Narnia, there's a scene in the book entitled The Silver Chair. It's a scene of two children, a boy named Eustace and a girl named Jill, crying out to Aslan in their own country as they're being chased by bullies in the schoolyard. And all of a sudden, there's a door in the schoolyard that usually just leads out to the moor where they could escape away. The door opens, and it doesn't lead out to the moor. It leads into the magical country of Narnia. There in the magical country of Narnia, Jill is confronted by the lion Aslan, who is the Christ figure in the allegory. And Jill says, I'm so glad to meet you. We were calling to you. We were calling out to you. We wanted you to save us from the bullies. We wanted to enter your country. And Aslan looks at her and says this, you would not have called to me unless I had been calling to you. All human movement toward God comes only in response to God's first movement toward humanity. How did the blind man see Jesus clearly? Jesus initiated. And then the man complied. Look at verse 7 with me. Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he, the blind man, went and washed and came back seeing. The man born blind complies by doing exactly what Jesus said to do. Here's an important principle for discipleship. We will never know who Jesus is apart from doing what Jesus says. Jesus is clear about this a little earlier in his gospel. In John chapter 7, he's talking about people that want to know if he comes from God or not. He says this, John 7:17. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. The doing comes before the knowing. Everyone says, well, if I knew, then I would do. Jesus says, you've got to do, and then you will know. There's a strange piece of paper I keep in my office. At some point, I should probably write this down a little clearer, a little better, but it sits on my door. I pass by it every time I exit my office. It's from a story that our late pastor emeritus, Dick Woodward, told back in 2013 when he preached a sermon the Sunday following the departure of our previous senior pastor. He told a story about a Navy fighter pilot that he knew in Virginia Beach. And the pilot shared with them what their training was when they got lost. That if they were ever to get lost out over the wide expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, they were trained to do this. The first thing was confess. Confess that you're lost. Admit it. I am lost. The second thing they were trained to do is climb, get higher, gain altitude, because at a higher altitude, the air is thinner and you would conserve fuel. You would conserve your resources to deal with your lost state. And then they were trained to communicate. Also at a higher altitude, the radio waves go further. And so you were trained to communicate with the tower. Say what you're seeing, what's going on, what are your instruments reading? And then the one that gets me emotional every time, the last thing Dick said they were trained to do was comply. Do whatever the tower tells you to do. And Dick said what was good for Navy fighter pilots is good for every human being. we have to confess. We have to confess that we are lost. And this is why I put it on my door and I pass it every time, because I know there's gonna come a time in my life at some point where I'm not gonna see the world quite as clearly, when I'll be lost. And I'll need to remember to confess that I'm lost and then actually comply to do what the towers, the authority around me, trusted friends and disciples of Jesus tell me to do. When you're lost, remember all 7 I am statements of Jesus. I am the bread. I am the light. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. I am the way. I am the vine. Jesus is the ultimate tower. Why do we resist complying with his direction? See, in John 9, we have this invitation to see Jesus clearly. And the blind man sees him clearly because the blind man complied. And then the blind man reflected. A little later in the passage, the blind man is now surrounded by controversial opinions about Jesus. We learn a little later this healing took place on the Sabbath, which was against the oral law that the Pharisees had added to God's law in the Torah. And they said, well, if this man's sinning like this, violating our rules, then how could he actually be from God? How could he do this? And there's this debate, is he from God or is he a sinner? And the man responds in verse 25, one of the more famous verses in the Bible. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Controversy surrounds Jesus. Opinions about Jesus multiply with every passing generation. And the blind man cuts through all the debate by simply reflecting on his life before meeting Jesus and contrasting it with his life after meeting Jesus. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. You can do this in your own life. You can also do it as you witness what Jesus does out in the world, what it looks like when his kingdom breaks through on earth as it's already broken through in heaven. I got the chance to see this a couple Friday nights ago at our Night to Shine event, which is an event where we welcome people with all kinds of different abilities and throw a big party to welcome them in, to help them experience the joy of God's kingdom. One thing that was struck, the image that stood out to me all throughout the night was we had college football players from Christopher Newport University and college football players from the College of William and Mary welcoming our honored guests as they came into the worship room. This stood out to me because college football players, I just imagine, are what our society thinks of when you think of ability. When you think of an able-bodied person, who wouldn't want to be able to say, yeah, I played football in college? And they were welcoming people that our society labels disabled. It was just this incredible contrast. The football players were not being cheered on to score another touchdown. They were cheering on those who could never make the team. That night, the first were last. The last were first. The exalted were humbled, and the humble were exalted. I saw doctors, lawyers, this pastor just breaking down in tears, realizing that they thought they had so much to give. They were receiving more than they could ever get away. Those people our society exalts were humbled, just as the humbled were exalted. In Christ, those the world calls handicapped and pushes out to the edge, became whole and welcome in. And I saw it. I saw the way our world treats people with different kinds of abilities, and I saw the way they're valued and honored in the kingdom. Sponsors who thought they had so much to give realized they were poor. And the poor in spirit realized theirs was the kingdom. See, John 9 is this invitation to see Jesus clearly. And the blind man sees Jesus clearly because he reflected on what his life was like before and after seeing Jesus, meeting Jesus. And then the man counted the cost. In the story, the Jewish leaders at first don't believe the blind man received his sight at all. They say there must have been some kind of mistake. Remember, the neighbors were saying, this really isn't him. And the guy goes, no, it is me. There's a lot at stake here. Let me try to explain it. This may be surprising, but of all the healing stories in the Old Testament, there is no recorded healing of a blind person. Naaman the Syrian is healed of leprosy. King Jeroboam's withered hand is restored. Hezekiah's life is extended in the face of terminal illness. The widow of Nain's son is raised from the dead, yet the healing of the blind was only something the Old Testament prophets looked forward to. Tim read about it from Isaiah earlier this morning. Isaiah 35, verse 4, say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. With the recompense of God, he will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. See, healing of the blind wasn't about who had the power to do it or not do it. Elijah raised a widow's son from the dead. Healing of the blind was about identity. It was about identifying the Messiah, identifying God's arrival to save his people through a new Exodus journey. And so as the Pharisees consider the miracle, they're asking themselves, is this possible? That the Messianic age is breaking in? But he violated the oral law. Anyone who violated their laws, they assumed to be a sinner. How could a sinner have performed an unprecedented miracle? How could a sinner usher in the Messianic age? You see the tension of the story. There's a lot on the line. And so the Pharisees first check with the man's parents to determine if he was actually their son. They confirm, now here's what's fascinating, listen to this. They confirm it was their son. They confirm he was blind. They confirm he now sees. They refuse to confirm how. Why not? Why won't they say Jesus did it? The answer is in verse 22 of our passage. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews or the Jewish leaders. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. To be cast out of the synagogue was to have your social standing destroyed. No one would talk to you, work with you, loan you money. It was the social equivalent of the death penalty. The parents won't take the risk. They refuse to pay the price. This, again, raises the stakes when the Pharisees call the blind man back and press him one more time. How did this happen? The question that looms in the reader's mind is, will he count the cost and will he be willing to pay the price? Verses 31 through 33. We know that God does not listen to sinners, he said. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He counts the cost, and then he pays the price. Verse 34, they, the Pharisees, answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. You're banned. You're cast out from the synagogue. No one will talk to you, work with you, loan you money. You'll never get married, have kids, start a business, or enjoy the financial security that comes with those things. The man counted the cost, and the cost was high. Luke 14 illuminates what the man did. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. John 9 is an invitation to see Jesus clearly. The blind man saw Jesus clearly because the blind man counted the cost. And lastly, the man humbled himself. In verse 38, when the man believes Jesus as Lord, the sovereign of his life and the Son of Man who came to bring an everlasting kingdom, that's the moment. That's the heart of his seeing Jesus clearly. Again, he's gone from calling Jesus, the man they call Jesus, to a prophet, now to Lord and Son of Man. And then I want you to notice the first thing he does after seeing Jesus clearly. In verse 38, he says, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. More vividly in the Greek language in which John is writing, he prostrates himself on the ground before Jesus. He kneels down. He put his face in the dirt. He humbled himself. And Jesus comments on this in verse 39. "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Remember in our passage, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." What do we know to be true about light? Light both reveals and it blinds. It helps you see, and if you look directly at it, you can't see. Listen to what Jesus says to the Pharisees in verse 41. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains." Who sees Jesus clearly? The man humble enough to admit his blindness. Who ends up blind? Those who claimed to see. John 9 is an invitation to see Jesus clearly. So how do we actually see Jesus clearly? Let me ask a few questions for our reflection now and in our groups later this week. Have you responded to Jesus' initiation with a heart to comply? Do you regularly reflect on your life before Jesus and after? This is an important one. What cost of discipleship have you been unwilling to pay? Do you consistently humble yourself to worship Jesus as the world's and your life's true Lord? See, in our passage, the word "eye," as in eyes to see, it's repeated a whopping 9 times. Verse 6, verse 10, verse 11, verse 14, verse 15, verse 17, verse 21, verse 26, verse 30. 9 times the word eyes or eye is repeated. John is asking, he's begging you to ask yourself, have your eyes been touched? Do you see Jesus clearly? But do you know Jesus? So how do we know? How do we know when we've actually seen Jesus clearly. There's a stunning detail in verse 9 that our English translation obscures. Let me read it to you. Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." And that kept saying is the imperfect tense. He kept on saying over and over again, "I am the man, I am the man," except in the Greek language in which John is writing, there is no "the man." The man born blind simply says over and over again, "I am, I am, I am." Exodus. See, the one who sees Jesus as the light of the world reflects Jesus' light to the world. That's what it means. That's how you know when you've seen Jesus clearly. Are you reflecting the light of the world into the world? Seeing Jesus clearly is never for our own clarity. Seeing Jesus clearly affects how we serve, what we turn to in our stress, how patient we are, how quickly we forgive, how we steward the resources God entrusts to us, how we open God's gift of human sexuality, how it affects our compassion, what we see when we see the least, the last, and the lost. And again, I'll commend our outreach fair after the service. We can consider how us seeing Jesus clearly as the light of the world affects how we reflect his light in the world. One night this week, I sat down to have dinner with our guests at the emergency shelter. At the dinner, I was having a conversation with one of the guests, and he said, "You know, God is good, but he's fairly mysterious. God is good, but he's been pretty quiet in my life." We can all relate on some level. And as I worked through the passage this week, I was struck by one Bible scholar's translation of verse 3. Dale Bruner wrote, "But this happened so that the way God works could be made especially clear to him." In John 9, we see how God works. In the midst of the mystery and the quiet, Jesus initiates. And when we comply, reflect, count the cost, and humble ourselves, we open the invitation to see Jesus clearly. We know that Jesus is the road in, and we begin to know the road in.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we hope you'll join us as we walk the Exodus way and learn to trust God on the way out of Egypt, the way between in the wilderness, and the way into his presence.